It's my privilege, my honor actually, to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Bernice Pescosolido. And you always have to work at that, I do. But I should easily remember her first name because from a personal touch, my wife's mother's name is Bernice. So I've lived with that for a lot of years. She is, as many of you know, a distinguished professor of sociology at Indiana University. She's the director of the Indiana Consortium for Mental Health Services Research, co-director of the IU Network Science Institute, and she's a graduate of Yale, and I think has so many, they're in your handout, but so many honors and degrees, awards, et cetera, from others that I'm not going to spend our time on that. What I would like to do is to just give you my little perspective, having been familiar with what she's done for some time. If we sit back and even look at why we're here, we have social entities. We can make networks out of those. We can connect those networks to try and have impact on communities and institutional structures because we've all come to realize that's how you bring about change. We can use those to influence people's attitudes and actions. And then some people have the skills, the insight, the innovativeness to say, how do we now do all of that, use all of those to move them into arenas of health service? Let's fight stigma. Let's take on suicide. Let's actually implement it into programs. And those turn out to be, now how do we standardize it? Patterns, pathways to care, adherence, outcomes. You've now just heard, I think, a description of what Professor Pescosolido really does, and I could not resist when I was reading some of the stuff in her thing. I'm usually not alliterative, but some days I am. So we're going to hear about sociology, influencing society, helping to essentially address structures to take on, in services, stigma, suicide, students, schools, and that includes college campuses. I had to give you all those S's first. So at this stage, I would just also like to say that she is, I think, we share someone in common, and she's been involved with many advocacy organizations. So in so many respects, she is basically a wonderful launch for this conference. Before stopping, because I otherwise sometimes forget it, I want to just, well, we welcome her up here, but I want to take the opportunity to thank basically the team that put this together. I'm up here launching this, but it's not my meeting, and you'll hear from some of them during the introductions, but especially Trish Meyer, who interacted with many of you. Give her a round of applause. So now, moving on with this, please join me in welcoming Dr. Bernice Pescosolido.
Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate it. Good morning. I'm going to start where John left off, although I'm not sure that his reference to his mother-in-law was a positive or a negative. But Bernice is kind of an ancient name, so most people that I know that are named Bernice are either somebody's elderly aunt or apparently mother-in-law, or actually there was a famous hooker on one of the TV show, one of the soap operas named Bernice. So I don't know where to go with that. But anyway, what I wanted to do today was to think about the wonderful work that's being done here. And I wanted to start with a story that really starts from where John left off. Because it is about how much this has been a struggle to get this on the radar of college administrators. And I'm so proud of all of you who are here who are part of that struggle. In 1989, I submitted a grant to the National Institute of Mental Health. And my interest was trying to understand pathways to mental health care. Because I cut my teeth on the really wonderful models that people had developed, like the health belief model developed here at the University of Michigan, or the socio-behavioral model developed by Ron Anderson at the University of Chicago. It was a very exciting time. And I thought those models were terrific. They were elegant, they had a good match with survey methodology. But the one thing about them, after I worked with them for a while, was I didn't know anybody who made their decisions that way, who did this sort of rational calculus of, yes, I have this much insurance and it hurts this much. And everybody that I knew that traveled pathways to care, not just mental health care, but any kind of care, it was usually kind of an ugly and messy struggle. And so I wanted to develop a model that in the tradition of sociology was kind of ugly and messy and realistic. And in doing so, and that became the network episode model, which does focus on the issue of how we sort of bounce from person to person until we end up in care or not in care, depending upon what those other people are advising us to do. So I had developed, sort of proto-developed that in my dissertation. And my first grant, I apply to NIMH and I say, I want to do this study to develop this proto-model that I'm going to call the network episode model. And I said, because it strikes me that we want to know why we're not explaining why people take so long to get into mental health care. And at that time, why only 1 in 5 people get into care when they have mental health need. So I argued in the proposal that, the best place to do this was on college campuses because it's major age of onset, right? It's a place where the networks are absolutely changing, especially on the residential campuses. And it's something we hadn't looked at before. Well, when I got the review back, I kind of put it in my desk, very ashamed because it wasn't even discussed. And the reviews basically said, Peggy Thoits is a colleague of mine. Many of you probably know her work on stigma and the self. And she was my mentor at that time. And she came and she said, what happened to that first award? And I said, they didn't discuss it. She said, let me see the pink sheets. And I was like, all right. So I gave them to her. And she said, well, they want you to call. And I said, really? I said, they didn't even discuss it. And so I called and they said, we've been waiting to hear from you. We love what you want to do, but could you get real and study people who have mental health problems? Because college students don't have mental health problems. And I was kind of gobsmacked at the time because that wasn't what I was witnessing in my career, but it's taken really a very long time, and I think through the work of people like John and the other people here to really come to this understanding of why it's so important to start at college campuses. And I think I'll go full circle in the end and try to show you why I think it's even more important that we're doing this now. So I'm going to start with this I stole directly from the CDC and the movie And the Band Played On, which is about HIV/AIDS and the history of the early epidemic. And when they sat at the CDC, at least in the fictionalized version, they sat around and they said, what do we think? What do we know? What can we prove? Okay? And one of the things that I think is very important and exciting about what's being done here is there is this link between research and the attempt to change social institutions and social communities. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into 3 different topics today. I'm going to talk about what we know about stigma and stigma change in the United States as a whole, right, as our culture. I'm going to talk about what we know about this in terms of attitudes towards youth, and then also what college students think. And then finally, I'm going to talk about what do we think we can change and how might we change it. And I hope on the one hand, on the one hand, I'm hoping like it isn't too shocking. And on the other hand, I hope it's really shocking, right? So we'll see. We'll see where that lands because I think you're a pretty enlightened group. Okay, so I just want to start. This is probably something everybody sitting here knows, but just to remind you that really the serious scientific study of stigma began, well, first with Race and Prejudice and the psychologists Al Port and sociologist Robin Williams. But the first real treatise on mental illness came as a result of Erving Goffman's year in which he served as a psych tech at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. And he wrote the book Asylums, and then after he wrote Asylums, he wrote this book Stigma, in which he defined stigma as the mark which of course comes from ancient Greece, where they used to brand the slaves so they could tell who were the slaves and who were the free men. But it's now a social mark that identifies an individual as presenting an attribute that makes them different. And it makes them different not only in terms of just setting apart, but it also has a negative connotation in that it outlines a person having an attribute that makes them less than fully human. So it's a devaluation kind of approach. And his 4 takeaway points, I think, really just sort of boil down what contributions that he made that I think are essential to our basic understanding. And the important thing is that stigma disqualifies people. When we talk about stigma now, we usually talk about stigma as a mark, but the mark does 2 things. It results in prejudice, which are the attitudes, values, and beliefs, and discrimination, which is the behavior. And we've always known as social scientists that there's a fuzzy link between attitude and behavior, but nonetheless, we'd like to change both of those things. And so one of the things that stigma does is it disqualifies individuals from full citizenship, and so it separates them and isolates them. But it can only have an effect in social isolation, because while people can self-stigmatize, that is also part of a basic process of identity formation that requires interaction between yourself and other people. It has different forms, and I'll probably mention some of the different forms as we go through the discussion this morning. This afternoon, and it's dynamic. We know it can change, and so it can fundamentally affect the illness careers of people who have mental health problems, and we want those careers to end in recovery. And of course, using the sort of Bill Anthony definition of recovery, you know, the best life, the highest quality life a person can have despite their illness, okay? We don't want to discount the part that these illnesses are very serious and do have really major effects on individuals. Okay, so what do we know from Goffman to now? What have we proved in terms of stigma? Well, we know it has very bad consequences, and what I've done here is just to outline some of those consequences that affect you not only as individuals, but if you are providers, or if you are family members, then you probably have experienced courtesy stigma as well, which is sort of that spillover effect. But there are also very serious consequences in terms of the funding that goes to college programs for mental health. And one of the things that we hope is that as we get this on the radar of administrators, and I do think it's there now, we can start to build more services for the students that we serve. But I think the most frightening statistics I've seen recently are the studies coming out of the US and then out of the Nordic countries that sort of assess the impact on life expectancy for people who have mental health problems. And they argue, as the Surgeon General did in 1999, that one of the reasons that people have lower life expectancies is because that stigma spills over to the kind of access that people have to other forms of health care. There are studies about emergency rooms, there are studies about ICUs, and how they react to people who are known to have mental health problems. There's also the issue of how this pervades a society, and we might refer to that, or I refer to that generally as public stigma. And I'm going to be talking mostly about public stigma today. I had no intention of ever studying stigma. I was interested in pathways to care. That's what I wanted to understand. And once we were able to show that one of the reasons that we don't do a good job explaining when and how and why people get to care is because there are different pathways, and we've called those pathways the choice pathway. Even after a long period, some people make a decision and say, I need to go, right? But about a quarter of people in our study in Indianapolis showed that, or revealed that they were coerced into care. 2 kinds of coercion. Sort of being forced into care by institutions, whether it's mental health courts or the police bringing them to the psych ER. And then another third were the most curious, and those were individuals who reported what we called a pathway of muddling through. We kind of stole that term from the political scientist Charles Lindblom, who said that that's how American policy is made, by kind of muddling through and responding to crises, and that sounded like it fit. So once we did that, I started thinking about the idea that the networks matter, but the networks determine how much push or how much social influence is going to happen. But it's really what's inside those networks in terms of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that's going to shape the direction whether you go toward the mental health system or run as fast as you can away from it. And so I started thinking about this, and being a well-trained sociologist, I thought, stigma, Goffman, got to go study stigma. And so I called Bruce Link, who, as many of you know, was the sociologist, or is the sociologist, who really has had an entire career studying stigma, not a late comer like myself. And I called him and I said, Bruce, I just went through the literature and I can't find anything on stigma anymore. Or not very much. And he's like, I said, is that true? Is it true that we haven't had a national study since 1955? And he said, yep, that's true. And I said, well, we have to change that. We have to do a national study of stigma. And he was like, yeah, good luck. And but the thing that motivates me most is when somebody tells me I can't do something. So I'm probably every parent's worst nightmare, because tell me you can't do something, I'm going to do it. So I said to Bruce, okay, we have to do this. We have to lock arms and do this. And we went hat in hand and begged everybody, can we do this? Can we do this? And we finally convinced the MacArthur Foundation. And I want to show you some of the findings from that, just to set an idea of what's happening in American society right now. Now, one of the reasons that I got so hepped up about this is because the reaction that we got when we went from place to place and said, we need to do this national study, we need to monitor what's going on in American society. The first reaction we got from many people, including the 2004 president of the American Psychiatric Association, is that stigma has dissipated in the United States. I had just spent 9 months in 2 psychiatric units in Indianapolis. I didn't see any evidence that stigma had dissipated. And then the second thing was, and this was more than NIMH response, was, yeah, we know it's out there. Send us a randomized clinical trial to get rid of it. And I'm like, well, I'm not an interventionist, right? And I think that knowing what kind of RCT we want to do might depend on what our target is, and we don't really have a good sense, except that we know it's bad. So those were the kinds of things that we were fighting against. And some people say, well, maybe that wasn't the right thing to do. Maybe you shouldn't be focusing on public stigma, because who cares? What we care about is the lives of people with mental health problems. And I agree that self-stigma is a really important issue. But I also am a sociologist, and one of the things that we believe is that people's biography are tied to their history. And the private issues that they face are tied fundamentally to the public issues that they encounter. And I can't think of anything more cruel than doing training on empowerment and then sending people into a cruel culture. So my sense was that psychologists were doing a really good job at a lot of the levels that I am not really trained in, but that we had a role to play. And so we were able to do this study. And these are called the General Social Survey Studies, or the National Stigma Studies. And I'm not going to go into this in great detail. If you want things, let me know. I'll send them to you. But the General Social Survey is a representative sample of the United States that's been ongoing since 1972. And it's the basic monitor of Americans' attitudes and opinions and behaviors. And so we wanted to be part of that because we knew it would give us really good science. Okay. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this table because this is a depression conference, and we looked at 5 different scenarios. And we thought this was important because we wanted to not ask, would you sit next to somebody on the bus who has mental illness? Right? Because we didn't even know what they were thinking. Are they thinking about a kid with ADHD? Are they thinking with a college student who is so stressed out they're having an anxiety problem? Are they thinking about a person with schizophrenia? So what we did was we worked with psychiatrists and survey researchers to come up with 5 stories that would meet clinical criteria for these diagnoses, because that's what people encounter in the community. They don't encounter somebody with a label, you know. They really encounter a person behaving. So we wanted to see if they could recognize it, because when you say mental illness or even depression, you know, we don't really know what they're thinking about. Well, this way we know exactly what the stimuli are with regard to the questions that we were asking. And then we asked a number of questions about prejudice and discrimination. And the one that's most often used in stigma studies is called social distance. Again, drawn from the race literature in Bogardus's 1966 scale. We adapted it, Bruce had adapted it for mental health. And it asked about these different venues. And I just want to highlight a few things on this table. The first is that across the different kinds of mental health problems and across the different venues, in some way, at some time, almost half of Americans indicated some prejudicial attitudes towards people with mental health and substance abuse problems. That number is lower, all right, significantly lower, but still over a third of the population indicating that they do not want to have contact in some venue with people with mental health problems. And then finally, that there is a big difference in terms of the venues, and the kind of conclusion that Joe Phelan, another stigma researcher, came to as part of our group was the more intimate the venue, the higher the level of rejection. But, you know, please, you know, half of Americans saying, please don't let them work closely on the job with me, and for sure, I don't want them to marry into my family, okay? The thing is, they probably are working close to Americans on the job, but Americans won't reveal it because they know that they're going to encounter stigma. Okay, so that we know that we get a better sense of with the venues we have to work in and the kinds of levels that we're dealing with. The other thing that we found that becomes increasingly important as I go through some of the data here is that one of the things that was very disappointing was that we found that Shirley Starr, when she did her study in 1950, her beginning question was, what is mental illness? And it was just open-ended. And so we trudged up to University of Chicago. And you know that last scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark where he brings the Ark into this warehouse and it just sort of gets put somewhere? Well, I have to tell you, University of Chicago and the University of Michigan have places just like that. Because we were able to go to the University of Chicago and get one of every 3 surveys that Shirley Starr did. And then we were able to come here and talk to James Jackson and Tony Antonucci and get all of the surveys from Americans View Their Mental Health, which was commissioned by a joint committee of Congress in 1949. So there was a 56-57 study and a 76 study. And so we could actually recode all of that data with contemporary coders so that what we saw is real change, not coders in 1956 thinking one way and coders in 1996 thinking another way. The real shock of this was that spontaneously there was a dramatic increase in the number of people when you asked them what is mental illness, they mentioned violence. That seems to be a particularly American metaphor or association with mental health problems, because I had a graduate student who's now at Boston University, and she compared stories on mental illness across the major newspapers in 3 societies. If you look at her last name, you sort of realize why she chose Iceland, because she's Icelandic. But then she also compared Germany to the United States. And the dominant story in the US on just newspaper reports about mental illness, a huge percentage of them, about half of them mentioned mental illness mentioned violence as part of a story on mental illness. And just 34% talked about that people with mental illness being, you know, criminals or more likely to be criminals, and a lot of fear being expressed with regard to any articles that had to do with mental illness. This was not the same in Germany, where the major theme was really, let's not make the same mistakes we made in the past, or in Iceland, which he tells me is the most perfect society on earth, where they were like, they're Icelanders, we need to embrace them all. So, so that's something that really seems to be very American and something we need to deal with. There's good news, though, okay? Because I don't want you all leaving here all depressed, because John would have a lot of people at his door at that point. But it turns out that the public has become much more sophisticated about mental illness, and that's a good thing. They're pretty knowledgeable. The greatest change that we saw since 1955 was the willingness to talk to family and friends. Dramatic increase from 1956 to 1976 to 1996. Really a dramatic increase. Not a dramatic increase in the use of services or a dramatic increase in the use of lawyers, which was something that was relatively high in the 1950s, but greater openness to talk to family and friends, and that's a good thing. And then the final thing that we saw was that there was a greater, we asked them in one of the surveys about, psychiatric medications, and they were like, yeah, they work. Yeah, they work really well. And then we asked them about Prozac, and they were like, no, we don't like Prozac. But we don't know if that's just a general finding. In survey research, when you ask about something general like Obamacare, like they hate it, right? But you ask them specifically about the platforms, and they're like, I love it, I love it, I love it, right? So there is this kind of, depending upon how Americans are thinking, there's this sort of relationship between the generic and the specific, right? So I'm not sure what that meant or what psychiatric medicine that they're thinking of. Now, I do have to say that while they believe that they work and that they don't have very many side effects, they don't want to take them. They want you to take them, okay? So that was the other thing that we found in that study. Okay, now, we were able, NIMH had a sort of time when they were interested in stigma. It was a very small window, but we were able to get a 10-year follow-up study funded. And it was really important because that decade from 1996 to 2006, in which the Surgeon General's report occurred and in which the President's New Freedom Commission report was published in 2003, was really a decade that we threw more at stigma than we had in a long time. And so we wanted to know whether or not prejudice and the potential for discrimination had changed. And this first graph on the left indicates whether or not they've changed in terms of their ideas about mental illness as being a biological disorder or a disease. And it turns out for depression, and you can't really, again, I can send you this paper, or whatever, but it's very clear that we're hitting a ceiling. So with depression, there was a significant increase across the decade in terms of Americans saying that the depression vignette was due to genetic causes or chemical imbalance. All right, I won't comment. I'll let people like John, who know better, comment on where psychiatry stands on the chemical imbalance hypothesis at this point. I'm not qualified to talk about that. But Americans have gotten the idea. From World War II on, we had argued that the way to change stigma was to argue that it was a disease like any other, right? That was the major tagline. And guess what? It worked, okay? Americans get it. Now, do they believe it in their heart of hearts? I don't know. I'm a sociologist. This is what they tell you. And even if it is a social desirability effect, I'm glad that they know enough not to say something stupid, right? So I figure that's the first step toward reducing stigma, especially prejudice, okay? And with regard to treatment, again, a significant increase regarding depression to tell this person they should see a medical doctor, and also significant increase in willing to say that this person should go to a psychiatrist. So our message about going for treatment, that there are treatments that work, has also come across, okay? All right, here's the bad part. There's the one on prejudice, the social distance change over the decade, right? And the way that you read this chart is that if that line that's called a whisker goes across the 0 line, then there's no significant change. And there was absolutely no significant change in stigma from 1996 to 2006. Now, what was important about that is that we had argued as a society, and certainly advocates had argued, that when people understand it's a disease like any other, stigma will dissipate. What this says is we need a new tagline. We get it, the Americans get it, that this is a brain disorder, but we are not hitting at the heart of stigma in the way that we're doing that. So the disease like any other tagline has taken us as far as it's going to take us. Okay, what about children? The 2002 study focused on attitudes toward youth with mental health problems. And what we see, again, I'm just going to focus on the depression findings, that about half of Americans could correctly identify that vignette as a depression, right? So that's good. Again, Americans seem to be much more knowledgeable. And even if they couldn't specifically identify it as depression, even more could identify that it was a mental health problem. And one of the interesting things we found from this study was, but even though they could identify it as depression or as mental illness, of those that could correctly identify it, 12% said, don't call it a mental illness. Okay? Let's come up with some other way to talk about this. And we see in the literature really a movement toward talking about specific disorders. But I think that's something we really need to think about. Okay. Now, here's the thing that really shocked us. This was an unexpected finding. And this is, since we had the 2006 data from, or do we use, I don't remember if we used the 1996 or the 2006 data in this study, but we had the 2002 data on youth, and we had the other data on adults. And, you know, in general, what we find is that Americans are much kinder toward children with mental health problems, much more inclusive, much less rejecting, okay, except for depression, okay? In depression, when we looked at it, in terms of on all of these measures, they were more stigmatizing of children with depression than adults with depression, okay? They thought they thought it was more serious in children, that it was not likely to improve on its own, that it was due to the way their parents raised them, and that they were more likely to be violent to others. Okay, this was not an expected finding. Now, I wanted to call this article something about Columbine effect, but I don't have any data to suggest that. But I do think it's partially a reflection of the way that media reports the rampage shootings that we see in the United States. And it's had its most startling effect on the way that Americans talk about depression in youth. And one of the things that I found in being part of Glenn Close's project, which I'll talk about in a minute, was that when we said, well, all of this has to come from the students. What do you want to hear about? The first thing that they said to me was, these were freshmen, or first-year students, we call them now, I guess. Would you come and talk to us about rampage shootings and whether or not Indiana University is likely to be a site of a rampage shooting? That's what was on their minds. So I think this is something that really informs what we do. Okay, now, I just wanted to show you this, I've already said this, which is where we could compare across the three studies. We see that, in general, that Americans are much kinder toward youth than they are toward adults. So, for example, 37% are willing to hang out with a person with depression, but if it's a child with depression, then they're okay with their kid hanging out with that child. And then when we ask college students, are you willing to, would you hang out with somebody with depression, we get even higher levels. So this, again, started us thinking about, should we really be aiming, maybe if we want to start changing stigma, do we want to aim at the general population, or do we want to start with the population that already has lower levels of stigma and get them to hang on to that greater tolerance that we see among college students? Because it might be an easier change to get students who are already more tolerant, to have them become the leaders of society than to try to change individuals in the general population. And so this is called cohort replacement theory, and it frustrates a lot of advocates, and I understand that. But if you look at a lot of the changes or the interventions that have been tried, they have good short-term effects and they extinguish in the long run. So we want to do something that really has a lasting change on American society. So these are what our students come to us with, that we ask them. These were, again, first-year students in their first couple of months at IU. We went after the whole first-year cohort, and we got a 40% response rate on the internet, which I've been told is like extraordinary. We did give them swag bags, and I'll talk about that in a minute, because that was a learning experience for me, which is one of the reasons I love doing this. But anyway, they come to us, and there's quite a significant group that feel uncomfortable, who are frightened, who are a little nervous, or feel they still feel that they are. They do have some stigma. So we can't eliminate awareness. We have to focus on awareness as well. And again, if we look at this, we see the highest levels having to do with issues of unpredictability and dangerousness, which is, again, that uniquely American association. Okay? Now, this is how they come to us. This is where we're asking them, how have you felt in the last couple of weeks? Now, this is nothing like the work that Daniel does here at University of Michigan about, what are the mental health problems of college students. That's not what we're after. We're going to leave that to the experts. We're after the stigma component. But we wanted to know, what was the average college student thinking? And again, we see sort of fairly significant levels that they're excited, but they're a little anxious and they're stressed out, which are the kind of things that we talk about in terms of seeing that age of onset and changing networks mattering for these students. So as we thought about this, we had a group of faculty got together and, group of faculty got together to try to design a pilot study. And the pilot study was part of Glenn Close's Bring Change to Mind, which is her nonprofit organization designed to end the stigma associated with mental health problems, because she is an advocate. Her sister was diagnosed very late in life with bipolar disorder. Her nephew has schizoaffective disorder. And she said she got sick of putting on, fancy dresses and going to, galas and giving money, and she wanted to do something that was meaningful. And so she came to IU at one point because one day I was in my office and I get this call on the phone, and it's, I pick up the phone, and it's like, hello, hello, and she says, hello, this is Glenn Close. And I'm like, yeah, funny, who is this, right? Who is this on the phone? I'm like, Carol, is that you calling me from Rutgers, you scamp? And she's like, no, 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 this is really Glenn Close. And I'm sorry, I'm a sociologist, I'm skeptical by nature, right? And so I'm like, really, who is this? And she goes, no, it really is Glenn Close. And then she says, and I just read your article in the American Journal of Psychiatry. I'm like, what? She says, well, I have to give a talk at the Society for Neuroscience, and I would like to include your article, but I don't really understand it. Can you help me? So I was like, well, yeah, okay. So, about three phone conversations later, I just said to her, look, you're an actor, right? It's an understatement. I'm like, you're an actor, right? She said, yeah. I said, I'm going to write you 3 scripts. I said, this is only 5 minutes of your talk, right? She said, yeah. I said, I'm going to write you 3 short scripts. Pick which one you want or change them however you want, And so that was the beginning of our relationship. And I asked her to come out to IU and speak. And what happened was we were at dinner, which the president's wife had a dinner for us. And she was there, and the provost was there, and the associate dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. And as we went around the table, it was really interesting, everybody telling stories of connection and courtesy stigma. And at the end of the night, the 3 of them, the provost and Glenn and the president's wife, are like, we need to do a college program. And they looked at me and they said, you're going to do this. And I was like, what? We were kind of in shock. And, Glenn is a little bit like an Energizer bunny or a tornado, whichever metaphor works for you. So about a month after she left, I called her and I said, Glenn, where is this toolbox you want me to evaluate? Right? Remember, I am a basic research scientist looking at pathways to care and stigma at the national level. And she says, evaluate it? You're going to create it. And I was like, what? And so then it became very clear that I had to get help. And so that was this picture of, this is faculty who are all volunteering their time, among others, to create this college toolbox. So I want to talk a little bit about that. The College Toolbox, we're just a pilot site. But the idea is, one of the reasons that I work with Glenn is that she wants everything that she does to be based on science. And that's unusual. because everybody who has advocacy organization wants to do good. But Glenn had this thing about science. I don't know where it came from, but that's why she called me about this talk that she was doing at the Society for Neuroscience. And we started doing work together where we've come up with a way to do a national evaluation of public service announcements before they go out. And we do them on 2 levels. We do a national survey, and then we do laboratory work. I don't do the laboratory work because nothing frightens a sociologist more than putting like electrodes on people's heads and stuff. So I work with people in the Department of Communications who do those biophysiological reactions to the public service announcement. So we developed that, and so, you know, so we were working with her on those kinds of things, and then, you know, she says, well, you're going to have to do this. Well, we decide on principles because we got asked to do a conference at the Cold Spring Harbor Lab. And I don't know if you know the Cold Spring Harbor Lab is one of the places where they developed the atomic bomb. And now they're asking whether or not we can come and do something on stigma. Well, talk about, you know, turning, you know, swords into plowshares. We were really happy to go. And we brought a bunch of students with us, and we came up with this idea to do an evidence-based pilot, a 4-way panel design with some additional subsamples. And the goal was to create this thing called You Bring Change to Mind. And you can see that U looks like a standard university kind of U. And the idea was it has to be by students for students. And let me tell you how we learned the lessons, some lessons the hard way. Well, so one of the things we were like, okay, we want to do an internet survey of all of the entering cohort and follow them for 4 years. Okay, wow, pie in the sky. If you're going to fail, fail big, right? So pie in the sky, we say this, and so we get the, you know, the provost is behind us and the president's wife is behind us, and they let us into the vault. I met the Dumbledore of Indiana University, who I didn't know existed, by the way, and so he let us into the data vault. Well, not us, we had to have an intermediary because we do human subjects protection. Right? But they sent an email out with a survey link to every every entering student that came in this fall. And we, you know, had all kinds of, you know, how are we going to get them to do this? Because we put together a student board, because we know if you want to change at the grassroots, it's got to come from the grassroots. It can't come from us at the top. I always tell a story about, hope I don't offend anybody, but there, you know, alcohol.edu I think is a very important program, but at Indiana University you must take it as a student before they allow you to register for classes. What we found out in our early research, because we thought they have a 99% response rate. We're like, yeah, right, 99% response rate. Well, what we found out is, yeah, they do it. They've made up a drinking game to go along with it. So we're like, okay, maybe we don't want to use that approach. So we got the students in a room and we said, what do you want? What do you want? What could get you, if you were coming into IU, what would get you to answer a 10-minute internet survey? Because they get one a week these days, right? I mean, sometimes they're like, well, which candy bar would you be if you were a candy bar? And some of them are like scientific. So they said, well, we want 3 things. We want course credit. Love those millennials, right? They wanted course credit. They wanted course credit, they wanted swag. I was like, okay. And which is stuff for those of us who are my age. They wanted stuff, and they wanted money. And we said, no, we can't give you money. Okay, so they were like, okay. So then we said, okay, swag. And so, you know, we sat around in the faculty and we were like, okay, because these faculty are from all over campus, right? Interventionists, thank you for joining us. But they were like, okay, how about, oh, let's give them some, you know, nice pens and pencils and some pads, and we'll give them, you know, and the students were so polite, but you could see they were trying so hard not to roll their eyes, right? You know what they wanted? Okay, those of you who are close to my age, hold on to your seat. They wanted fanny packs. They wanted fanny packs, they wanted tank tops, okay? And they wanted glasses, both these kind of glasses, sunglasses, but also glasses that when you hold them, you put liquid in them, they change color, and these change color in the sun. We were like, whoa, the 70s is back, right? Because we would have never thought to put any of those in there. So anyway, so And we got people to donate because, it turns out that college students, yes, they want tank tops, but they don't want just any tank tops. They want Comfort Colors tank tops, which are ecologically friendly and very soft, apparently, right? And so we're like, oh my goodness, these are $7 wholesale each. And we had 7,000 students coming to IU. We were like, okay, we don't have that kind of money, right? But, so Glenn goes, well, who owns this company, right? So Glenn gets on the phone. She goes, hi, this is Glenn Close. We got them for like $2 each. So we still had to have them printed. But anyway, we were able to put these swag bags together, and they were worth about $75 when all said was done. It was mostly donation and some from Glenn's organization. And so with a lot of hard work by a lot of people, we got a 40% response rate, which the university was absolutely overwhelmed with, because apparently when they send out a survey, they get a 6% response rate. So it takes a lot of work, but you can sort of get there. So the idea is that we not only have the survey, but the idea is to have student-led and inspired events and campaigns. And the idea is that once a year we have a campaign, a contest for a campaign, and you just figure out what students want. So they can either come to Glenn's Gala in New York, which is about 120 people. That's it. It's a very small gala. Or they can have $1,000 donated to their organization. Right? So you kind of figure out what students want, and I think a major university like this could do this. And so we've tried to do things that are scalable, and we're still working on this. We've made a lot of mistakes. We know what to tell you not to do. And when you picked up those postcards today, or they were handed out to you as you came in, we're getting ready to do a national rollout. This College Toolbox, everything in it will be evidence-based, but it's not all from IU. One of the things I would like to ask you is that any of you that are doing important things for colleges, we want to be able to include your materials, because Glenn's organization is going to package it professionally, they are going to market it nationwide, and they're going to distribute it free of charge. So any of you who have things that you'd like to see in the College Toolbox, please let us know, because we're getting very close. We have a starter manual just about done, which is mostly full of the mistakes we made, but other things that worked very well. And we're doing a very detailed manual that has all the research in it that was done, some by students, some by us, in terms of things that work. So that's sort of where we're moving. And this is the part where this is the part where I want you to think with me, okay? Because I think what we have to do is we do have to change that tagline. It's not just about awareness. You need awareness, don't get me wrong, especially among college students. But I think what we want to do is focus on this issue of similar competence, similar lives. Everybody's got something. And if you can get college students to tie into the things that make them anxious and nervous, then you can get them to open their hearts more to people who have mental health differences. And so that notion of similar difference. So this is the kind of thing that I really like, which is, this comes from Medco, which I think I don't know if it's a big pharma or an insurance company, I don't really care, but here they have all these major athletes, all of whom have different problems. But it is what I call an unobtrusive measure of stigma. What's missing? Okay, so you may have something in common with a world-class athlete: asthma, diabetes, high cholesterol, arthritis, cancer, HIV. Where's mental illness? Where's depression? We know there are plenty of athletes that have depression, right? We know they have other problems. We know plenty of people in Hollywood who have OCD and other problems, right? They're willing to talk. We need to sort of not be stigmatized by this. I'm going to show you another one that I love, okay? Well, actually, I don't love this one, but I will do this one first. So one of the things that we know is that we can test PSAs. I mentioned that one of the things that we did for Glenn. I want to show you the one that resonated with college students. The other two, I don't know if you know SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health something Services Administration. Yeah, well, one of the reasons I forget their name is after we showed them results of evaluating their sets of PSAs that were a result of the President's New Freedom Commission, they didn't talk to me for about 2 years because what we were able to show was that the one that I'm going to show you worked very, very well. The video game one worked for students, or worked for youth from like 15 to 18, and then the 18 to 25-year-olds, which were the target of this anti-stigma campaign, found it condescending. And this one on the door, and these are all online, so you can check them out, but the door one scared the heck out of people. So that actually increased stigma. So let me show you the one that works, because I think it's still very relevant and could be shown, you know, at college campuses. We're working with the IU Cinema to have them show a PSA before every film. So let me see if I can get this one to work, because I'm a little bit of a technophobe.
Everyone has friends. There's online friends, friends to go out with on a Saturday night, friends to hang out with and do nothing, friends who show up on moving day. And then there are the friends who'll be there if someone is dealing with a mental illness. Are you one of those friends?
So the focus, as you can see, is not simply on education, it's on inclusion. It's on connectedness, which then comes for me full circle back to the issue of social networks and why they matter. And again, you don't have to read these numbers. I can send you this if you want to see it. But all you need to know is that these are the data that show that wherever there are red blocks, you had significant change in the right direction. And you can see how much better the Friendster one was. And it accounts for most of the change in using the campaign overall. And you can see the door, right? Nothing worked. So anyway, okay. And then, as I mentioned, we not only did the national survey study, but we hooked people up to, well, I didn't, but other people hooked people up to, you know, machines. And we found the same thing. So laboratory study, national survey showed the same things. Now, the other thing that one of these lines shows is that young people also tend to change the channel. So we've got to get clever about how we use these things. Okay, so this one, again, you can find it online. It doesn't have anything to do with mental illness. But what it says is I think it's time to take off the gloves in terms of thinking about this. And what I love about this PSA is it goes through, and each of these persons says it's not acceptable to call me, and then whatever the stereotype is. And it ends with something from Glee, where Sue, what's her name, Sue Sylvester? Sue something. Anyway, is with one of her assistants who has developmental disability and uses the R word and says that's not okay. And I know that that's shocking to people in the community, but I want to say that for a reason. And that is that one of the things that Goffman does, to sort of end on going back to Goffman, is that he talked about the own. Those are the people with. He talked about the whys. Those are the people who are engaged in helping the with, okay? And then he talks about the unknowing. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves in part is whether or not we are trying to change the ideas of people who are the unknowing. Because the research is very clear. People who do not have contact with a person with a history of mental health problems are the most stigmatizing people in society. And so while we have had some negative reactions to, I'm going to show you the final PSA, because they feel that it wasn't nice. The question is, do you want nice or do you want change? And what these data show is that that if there's the presence of somebody with a mental illness in a television show, it actually attracts more attention. And this is measured by heartbeats. So apparently, as your heartbeat slows down, that indicates that you're spending more attention on something. So that's good. We can get people's attention by showing PSAs or including characters in television shows. What the graph on the right shows is that not only can we do that, but when we have those, the people with the most contact, okay, so your heartbeat drops the most if you're a person that doesn't have any connection with a person with mental health problems. So we can have the greatest effect on people who don't have contact, and they're the most stigmatizing. So how are you going to get them to pay attention? Well, you may know that the Brits have put 18 million pounds into reducing stigma in the UK. Their government has done that. They've taken money from the lottery, and they're hitting it at all levels. and they presented a lot of their stuff at the International Stigma Conference in Ottawa. And we convinced Glenn to try to get permission to steal one of their videos and make it an American version. Okay, so let me show you the PSA that we've had very different responses to, depending on whether you're the own, the wise, or the unknowing.
Hi there. Sorry to disappoint you if you're expecting a lunatic on a rampage. I'm Kalen, and I've been living with schizophrenia for 11 years. People like me with a diagnosis of mental illness face stigma and discrimination every day. Luckily, I've had the support of family and friends to help me live a full life.
It's time to talk about mental illness. Start the conversation and pledge to end stigma at bringchangetomind.org.
Okay, so I guess I should say I'm sorry if you're shocked and don't like it, but I guess I'm not going to. Because of all the PSAs that we've tested for Glenn, that one has had the most effect on changing the mind of people who don't have contact with people with mental health problems. That was her nephew, her sister, and her nephew's wife, and all their dogs, you know, which go everywhere with them. So anyway, in the end, I think those of you who are mental health providers, I really want to thank you for the work that you're doing. I think it's so important, and I think you are the key to creating a society in which stigma is reduced. I want to thank the Millennials. One of the reasons that we think it's so important that this happens now is that if you're sitting there and you're a millennial, what we know about you from research is that you have a supreme amount of confidence compared to past generations, and you feel you can change the world. And we are trying to leverage that sense of you wanting to be part of the change to do that. I want to thank the administrators who are here for supporting the efforts of the changes that are happening in terms of improving college mental health programs and supporting the anti-stigma research that's going on many campuses. And I really want you to think about what you have that works, that we can make part of the College Toolbox Project so that we can distribute it to everyone, so that colleges and universities that are doing the kind of important work that you're doing can have all the resources that currently exist available to them in the starter pack, and then as things grow and we come up with new ideas, that there will be a continuing way to get that information from Bring Change to Mind. I'm excited because on April 2nd, IU is doing its first major student event created by students. It's a kickball tournament, and so far we have about 14 teams signed up. One actually has faculty and graduate students as one of the teams, not me, but other faculty and graduate students. The prize is, again, either a trip to Glenn's Gala or $1,000 for their student organization. And one of the things I'm most proud of is it is really taking seriously this notion of take the gloves off, because the name of the tournament is called Kick Stigma in the Balls. Okay, thank you.
Does anyone have any commentaries that they would like to make? Otherwise, I'm going to do my usual, use an opportunity. I would suggest that all of the people that are here, that we work a little bit. We could do this after the fact, and Trish Meyer could do it, but we have a lot of campuses represented here. That last offer that you made, let's get a directory and let's forward it, and let's use some collective things to use this toolkit and start collecting data in a standardized way. Daniel will work with Bernice and we'll have a little effort. I was sitting next to him, but I didn't say this to him because I thought he might.
It's more powerful coming from up here.
So I think, I mean, this is partially the benefits of having a gathering where people come from multiple venues. If we can do this together, we're going to have more power, and then maybe there could be a follow-up presentation next year, the year after, and we'll have some data to show this is what that toolkit and B2C, bring change, B2, I had it once, but the BC2M.
Right,
you know.
and then you is the university version. There's also a high school version, by the way, that's being piloted in California. It's now in, I think, 23 high schools. So if you're working at that level or you have colleagues who are, that will be, I think that'll be rolling out a little later, but that's there too. The other thing is like, when we, you know, things in the toolbox are all evidence-based, but you know, it's not all evidence-based that's going to appear in JAMA Psychiatry. Some of the research is done by students, and we think that's really important because it becomes both a learning experience and gets them really, you know, so that you have students who want to go to medical school and they want to be in psychiatry. And a lot of times that courtesy stigma is, oh, you don't want to go into psychiatry. I was once at the National Institute of Heart, Lung, and Blood, and they asked me there to talk about my network episode model and how can they understand how do people travel different pathways when they have heart problems, because it's a pretty generic model in that sense. And I said, I don't even remember what I said, but I was saying like, well, I don't know anything about cardiology, but in psychiatry, blah, blah, blah. And this cardiologist leans over to me and whispers in my ear, psychiatry, that's hardly medicine. And I was so offended, and I'm like, you know, I'm a sociologist. We do labeling theory and all these other critiques of psychiatry, right? But I was really offended because we only have, what, 7,000 child psychiatrists in America? That is so few to deal with the kinds of issues that students are having today. So one of the things about getting the students involved, the medical students who feel like they don't have the pre-meds, who feel like they don't have time for anything, they've become our research core. And they develop, you know, I teach them how to do surveys, and they feel very empowered by that. And so, you know, you can make this part of classes, you can make it part of assignments, you can make it part of independent studies. And so it's by students, for students, and we take that very seriously.
When you take the statistics and the data, and 1 of every 6 people has just depression or bipolar, 1 of every 5 has, if you throw in a few more, 1 of every 4 if you take all of the so-called mental illnesses. These medical students have grown up with it, but they also have their own stigma, and all of these efforts change. So we have, I think, had a terrific start to the conference.